ever since I was little, I remember it being like just pounded into me that, beauty is in the eye of the beholder. And I was like, okay, well, as long as I'm the one beholding, I think a lot of modern art sucks. And modern art architecture as well. I just feel like there's so much stuff out there where all of us are collectively looking at this going, this is bad. And in some cases, it's not just bad in the form like, oh, I think my kid could have done that. It's like soul stealing. There's something about it that just makes you feel degraded when you're looking at it. And yet we're being told by all the experts that we're supposed to look at this with awe and wonder, and how this is just completely redefining what we think of beauty and art. And all of us feel like there's just something wrong. Well, our guest today is Julia James Davis. And Tina was the first one to come across her channel and be like, Nick, you have got to see this. And all of a sudden, I am listening to someone articulate everything I've been feeling about modern art, modern architecture. The difference is she's got all the education, all the credentials to kind of, justify what I think a lot of us have been feeling. So please welcome Julia James Davis from the channel, The War on Beauty. Thanks for being with us today.
Thank you so much, Nick. I'm so excited to be here and talk about art.
Yeah. So, listen, I do not claim to be some grand connoisseur or possess any sort of unique expertise. By the same token, when I was 18 years old, I had the privilege of being able to go to the Louvre and specifically to walk around the Monet Museum in Paris. And I remembered as I was just looking at this, thinking this was just gorgeous, and the amount of talent that went into it and the amount of expertise. There was something about it that just felt enriching. And so I completely understood when somebody looks at a Monet, or when somebody looks at the gorgeous sculptures within the Louvre, or they look at the various art and they think to themselves, my gosh, this is just sublime. It is absolutely beautiful. And then I look at the stuff that's selling for millions of dollars, and it feels like a cruel joke, except that you will find people up there, many people that you've probably gone to school with, been educated with, who will insist that if you don't think this is just the apex of artwork, it's because you don't understand, or you simply don't have the proper refined tastes. So what went wrong with you, Julia? You apparently don't buy this nonsense either.
Well, I think it's so interesting that you bring it up, talking about going to the Louvre and not having a background in art. I think the thing about great art and works of true beauty is that you specifically do not need a degree to understand it. You can be a child, you can be 5 years old, you can be uneducated, not from that culture. You can be literally an illiterate person and stand in front of these great artworks and get it immediately. But the opposite is kind of true with the present day contemporary art. You need a degree, you need to know so much art history to understand why a completely white canvas or a toilet on a pedestal is considered to be art. And so I think that's actually a really important point. So just to give kind of a little bit of a background about myself, because I think my life has kind of unfolded as like the perfect sort of test case for what I talk about now and what I think the solution is, which is basically returning to faith as a way to reclaim beauty. Because I was actually raised in a unique upbringing. I was brought up at going to the museum almost every weekend and traveling around the world, and my parents made sure I got exposed to so much art. And there was a really profound experience that I had around 5 years old with this amazing painting called The Judgment of Solomon. And I was 5, I didn't know anything about art, I didn't know anything about the Bible, what this painting was at all, but I saw it, and I think I stood in front of that painting, according to my mom, for like 20 minutes, and I was 5. It was just I describe it as an obliterating experience. It's just totally enrapturing and such a profound thing to actually have contact with beauty. And as you've probably experienced, it is something that is a contact with the transcendent, really with God, because God is the author of all beauty, as it says in Solomon 13:3. So that was a really important moment in my life, really a seed that was planted. And that's what, outside of I was already so interested and loved art, that turbo boosted my sort of lifelong passion for and education in art starting so young. But I noticed that as looking back now, as I got older, my tastes started to change as you get into your teenage years and you actually start also learning more about art. My taste started to change a lot, and especially by the time I was in high school, I was like post-war contemporary art, all the art that I'm so against now. That was what I loved, and it was what I wanted to do for a career. I wanted to be an art dealer. And so going through, college and wanting, working at those galleries and all of the programs and stuff, by time, it wasn't until I basically became Christian, I was converted into Catholicism, that it was like putting on new glasses, and I started to see like, wait a minute, this is not good, and this is actually not even art.
Well, can I stop you real quick? Because this is interesting to me, because like I've always been a Christian. I can't always say that I've faithfully lived out my faith, but I've always been a Christian. But there was something that struck you when you were 5, when you looked at the Judgment of Solomon painting. And then, as you said, over time and through your education, all of a sudden you started to like things that now you are constantly talking against. My question is, I want to give a special thank out to Mando. That's right, ladies and gentlemen. If you are look, I'm going to tell you right now, especially if you're a dude, right? If you're a guy and you're married, I always like to make this joke that if I want to romance my wife, I might get all dressed up and take her out to a nice dinner. But if I want to seduce my wife, I do about 3 hours of yard work. However, I know for a fact in her mind, as much as she might like that image, she wants me to smell and look clean before anything happens. And that's where Mando comes in, because not only is it a deodorant, but it actually stops the sweat control, right? It's got odor and sweat control. So if you want to check out some of these other products from Mando, I'm going to encourage you right now to go over and shopmando.com. That's shopmando, MANDO.com. You're going to use code Nick, because when you use code Nick, you're going to get 20% off plus free shipping. So go take a look at that right now. Again, smell good for your lady. Smell good for your lady. It's not too much to ask, guys. My question is, do you feel like you started to like that art because you thought it was genuinely aesthetically pleasing, or was there some other sort of influencing factor? Was there social pressure within the educational institutions that you were in, or within groups, or what do you think? Because again, a core component of what you talk about is this idea that we kind of know, right? We kind of know when we see something beautiful, and we kind of know when we see something that isn't. And yet you described your affinity for this sort of art at one point as being something that you really loved. So what do you think was the motivating component behind that?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really interesting question. I think that there's multiple things that go into it. First of all, it is the art, like you said, that does sell for millions of dollars. So I think that there is an aspect of glamour there where it's like, oh, that's really interesting. I mean, some of it looks sort of weird and intriguing. Like, for example, like a Damien Hirst shark in a formaldehyde tank. You're like, that's kind of something you don't see all the time. But I do think that because that there's this huge art scene that's come up, especially since World War II, where these art objects have such a cachet and a glamour, and the auctions and the gallery system around it. And that's, all the incredible like stories we hear for things selling for millions of dollars. And so I thought that was really interesting. And I think to a certain degree, that also does change your perspective. Well, if this is selling for that much, then it must be important. It must have some sort of meaning and value to it outside of the dollar value assigned to it. But then I also think the spiritual component. I was raised Jewish, but culturally Jewish, and so not really, like, I wasn't raised Christian. I wasn't raised going to church. Really, I went to, temple on high holy days, but never prayed. And by the time I was in high school, dealing with kind of the issues that high schoolers deal with, just angst and anxiety and all that stuff. Um, and then also going through school, like you said, I didn't go to a Christian school. So education definitely, I think, is anti traditional values, anti God. And so when just all of those factors together, you do start to have your mind shaped in a certain way where you can start accepting things like a toilet on a pedestal as art. And I do remember, though, one very specific moment that I think was so important in all of this, in terms of kind of the almost hypnosis that goes into this process of, I say it's almost like a transfiguring of something, because it is almost like a religious process that this undergoes, where a toilet can go and then all of a sudden be art. Like, that's a big leap to make. But I remember in college, there was basically a rule that you could not use the word beautiful to describe something. And so even in art history, so even when you're going back and you're studying the amazing Gothic cathedrals, or, some of the great works of the Renaissance, you can't use the word beauty to describe something, because it's considered to be subjective and therefore irrelevant to any sort of analysis of the work. And so I think doing that for, class upon class, paper upon paper, discussion after discussion, all through college, it does start to shape your own thinking, and it detaches that work from beauty. Like, that's not something, because you automatically self-censor and say, okay, that's not a word that I can apply. And after a while, you almost just forget that it's even part of the thing, even though it's so obvious.
So that's interesting, because I've always kind of suspected that obviously there's social and educational conditioning that gets people to look at something that just seems so obviously ugly, and to call it beautiful, or to at least come up with some sort of different description which gives it preference. And the economic factor is an obvious one, right? If you tell me something sells for $5 million, I'm going to assume that there's something I don't get, if somebody was actually willing to pay that. But you said something else in there that I thought was really interesting. And you were talking about kind of like all the angst associated with like going to high school and stuff like that. And I have a son and two daughters, and I can remember times, especially during different ages and whatnot, where there's confusion. And I almost wonder if, do you think you mentioned the whole idea of the shark and the formaldehyde jar? Do you think that there's something that happens to the youth with this sort of education where they're uncertain of their identity, or they're uncertain of their purpose, and the confusion or elevating some form of artwork that isn't traditionally beautiful almost has like a comforting feel to them, um, because it's almost like there's no real objective standard that they have to live up to? Do you think any of that factors in?
I do think so. And again, that's also interesting, because I think that in the sort of grand scheme of art history, how we can go from these amazing, incredible feats of beauty to saying literally a canvas painted pure white is incredible. It's amazing. Um, is that is what we are told. That actually art history has been progressing to this, like culminating in this, and that it's kind of the inevitable sort of peak and end of art, is that everything is sort of conceptualized to this stuff that we now see. So I think that, and I do think too, I mean, yeah, like you're saying with teenagers and stuff, there's a tendency to kind of have like rebellious tastes, I guess, to going back to like rock and roll, stuff that your parents wouldn't listen to or something like that, and have kind of edgier tastes. So I do think that could also play a part in it, except I think that the works that we're looking at and I critique aren't really seen as edgy. They're almost just seen as, at this point, canonized as sort of just the important works of today.
So the avant-garde has become the norm.
Yes.
Well, let me ask you this. You talk about your conversion, that basically finding God kind of changed the way that you thought about this. How did that work? Like how did you, was it one of these things where as you were, recognizing a need for God in your life, or was it something where things around you just weren't making sense and you sought out God? Like how did that process transpire and then take you on this new path?
Yeah, so my mother, she was raised Catholic, or sorry, she was born Catholic, not raised Catholic. She was born into sort of a poor upbringing, a really poor upbringing actually, and her mom baptized all of her kids Catholic just in case something happened to them and they died. But they weren't raised with any religion or really any practical, like not going to church, nothing like that. So I think that was kind of another seed planted in my family that ended up sprouting into something amazing. But when she married my dad, she converted to Judaism so that we would all sort of have the same sort of cultural upbringing, we're under the same umbrella. And so that's how I was raised. And by time it was COVID, I was in my last year of college, and I got sent home from my dream art program in London, which was at the Sotheby's Institute. And it was interesting.
Wow.
Looking back on this time. I think there were a few things that I saw there in terms of art where I was like, wow, this is really bad. I remember seeing at one of these auction previews, a woman, it was a sculpture of a woman face down in a shipping crate, sort of like in this crucifixion pose, but it was like the most disturbing. It was a Maurizio Cattelan sculpture, and he's the same artist who made the $5 million banana taped to a wall
Oh my
and some other
gosh.
things. But I remember seeing that, and I was thinking, no, that's not good. That's not gonna sell well. So there were some little seeds that were and things coming to me, but not in the same important big shift way that ended up happening. So I was sent home from this program, which is my dream program, back in my childhood bedroom, and feeling for the first time so disconnected from my passion, which was art, and feeling like, oh my gosh, I don't even know if I like this anymore, if I want to be an art dealer, what's the world going to look like after this? And it was a fortunate thing because back at home with my parents and my mom specifically, she started sort of returning to her Christian roots. And I started asking my family, what should I do? I feel so passionless. And they were like, my mom actually got invited to a Bible study, and she invited me to come with her. She was like, why don't you come with me and try this? Which really, by time I was in college, I would describe myself as an atheist. I didn't believe in God. I didn't think that that was anything relevant to today. Thought it was just something sort of for the past and just didn't apply anymore. And I felt like that's so not my thing, but I'm really at sort of a place where I'll try anything. And a little bit before then, I had been prompted to like kind of start praying in a very loose way. And going to this Bible study, I immediately felt like, wow, I felt like this is real. Like the Holy Spirit is real. I felt it. And from there, my mom really helped me so much with this in returning to her Christian and then ultimately Catholic roots. And for me, the same thing. And so it wasn't almost all of the sudden. I really look at it as putting on new glasses. Like I saw the world in a completely different way. And I think for the first time, although I was raised with such amazing parents and such a strong, moral framework, as in do this, this is good and this is bad, this is right and wrong. But having that internally for the first time in a real way made me say, oh my gosh, I really saw the world completely differently.
So because one of the things that my wife and I both found fascinating about your content was rejecting this kind of idea that, well, beauty is just in the eye of the beholder and it is purely subjective. And in your program that you do on the war on ugly,
Mm-hmm.
I don't, forgive me, I forget the name of, I believe it's a cardinal, but he's talking about, I think it's three components.
Bishop Fulton Sheen, yes.
Yes, he's talking about three components where he talks about violence and split personality. Can you talk a little bit about that and like how did that? Because again, you add this spiritual component into the explanation of beauty. Whereas I think a lot of us just we have been taught that it's all just visual, it's all just preference, it's all just, and the moment he's talking about those three distortions in your video, I'm like, oh man, this makes so much sense.
Yes. So the experiences that you've had with beauty, and for example, that I shared about being 5 years old and being totally stopped in my tracks by that painting, there's no way through those experiences, like you said, you have no background in beauty. I was 5. There's no way, if beauty is in the eye of the beholder, that we would have those experiences because we don't know. I didn't know anything. And so that must mean that beauty is dwelling outside of us, that it's a real, tangible value of an object that is totally independent of us. It exists whether we recognize it or not. I don't have to think a beautiful thing is beautiful. If I think that it's not beautiful, that doesn't mean that the beauty of that object stops existing. It's just a real thing. And so that is an important sort of development that has happened in recent times, is this subjectivity and relative way of looking at all things, not just beauty, but also morals. But that has, I think, been a key way that this, like I described it, a hypnosis, has been able to happen where we can say a banana is $5 million and it's a great work of art. But then at the same time, we know that that's objectively not true. So beauty is something that is a real mystery. It's a real thing that reveals a deeper truth about the world. It has a special connection to God. I know in that wonderful episode you guys did covering some of the War on Beauty clips, you shared one of the videos I did on Dietrich von Hildebrand, who I love, and I love his book Aesthetics. But he describes beauty as an echo of heaven. So it really is like this tether from the other world, from God. And so if beauty can reveal a deeper mystery about our world and our reality, and especially of God, again, as it says in Solomon, chapter 13, verse 5, it says, from the beauty of created things comes a corresponding understanding and perception of the Creator. If that's true, then you could probably suppose that ugliness has a similar thing, that it might also be revealing something about evil or the dark things of the world, which I personally think so, because I think that's the effect of ugliness, rather than pointing you upwards, is to point you downwards, and is actually a form of soul assassination. And so the Bishop Fulton Sheen, he describes evil and the kind of, like evil in 3 ways. It's the love of nudity, violence and aggressiveness, and split personalities. And when you look at contemporary art, those are 3 themes that are incredibly persistent and common. And just like you can see common themes in beautiful art, landscapes, even nudity, but I would say that there's a difference between nudity and nakedness. Um, and, of course, violent themes as well. We can still look at a scene of a battle or, a shipwreck or something. These are not pleasant things, but there is a transfiguration in the kind of mystery of the artwork and the artist and his talent that turns those difficult things into something beautiful.
No, that's I think the word mystery makes a lot of sense to me. I remember when there was the lawsuits with respect to Harry Flint, and one of the arguments that was used by the attorney when they were saying that the pornography that Flint was doing was just so perverse. And the defense was, as well, have you ever been to a museum? Have you ever seen works by the great masters? Have you ever seen works by the great masters in a series of being disrobed? Why do you call that art and this pornography? And one of the responses was, I can't define pornography, but I know it when I see it, or I can't distinguish between pornography and that, but I know it when I see it. And we do, right? There's something different between what we might call the observable beauty of the human form disrobed versus that which we can almost is appealing to lust or seduction in a way that's inappropriate. And I think it's the same thing with violence. We can I can look at the artwork of Ivan the Terrible holding his son after he delivered a killing blow, and I can see kind of the horror associated in his eyes with realizing what he's just done, versus other modern art where I'm looking at this going, this isn't meant to inspire a sense of introspection or the tragedy of a situation. It's meant to disturb.
When you look at those things, there's no redeeming quality about it, like you said. I think it's relishing the nakedness for shock's sake or the violence to disturb you. And there is actually a very interesting painting that is, I can't remember the exact date, but I think it's from the 1860s, where that really was the painting that was a major turning point in all of this, by Edward Manet, who's one of the Impressionists. And it's called Olympia. And it was modeled sort of after these classical nudes where it's a lying down woman, really similar to, for example, there's this great painting by Titian called The Venus of Urbino. I think it's specifically modeled on that. And so that's like the most beautiful female classical nude. And Manet did sort of this parody on it, where instead of this sort of transcendent figure, because in art there is that difference actually, and I will say this is one of the good things I learned in art history. There is a difference between being naked and being nude in a piece of art. So the nude is something that is more timeless, sort of like a Venus figure or like Aphrodite, and she's not aware that you're looking at her. She's sort of in this pure, encapsulated, sectioned off world. But then someone who's naked is aware that you're looking at them, and they're in that sort of recognition, it becomes part of this time and this world. And so there's a sort of vulgarity and wantonness about it. But the Manet's Olympia was taking something that was that nudity and making this prostitute in the same exact way, but she's looking directly at the viewer, which is something a little bit different and seen as provocative. And it's grounded, instead of in this transcendent, otherworldly time, in present day Paris. And so that was a huge outrage, and I think a major turning point in art. And so it is interesting when we look at the art that we have now and we say, oh my gosh, it's so shocking. Well, a lot of the shock and ugliness, it really started a long time ago. This is not something starting, 10 years ago. I would say even especially in the war on ugly, I think that there's one event that completely changed art, and that was World War I. But it started a long time ago, and instead of attempting to lift the viewer up and inspire them, it was, do you see how horrible our world is? This is the reality of our world. And
Well, can I ask you a question on that? Because playing maybe quite literally devil's advocate here, um, I guess one can understand why in a time following World War One with all the horrors of trench warfare, or when you look at some of the stuff that Picasso was painting, one might be able to look at the horrors of what's going on and using artwork as a kind of, I mean, if we're being generous, using it as almost like a political statement or a sense of awareness or whatnot. Um, how do we distinguish between that versus something that is just disturbing for disturbing's sake?
I think it's a good point. I mean, because I think art has long been political, and sometimes, like, even one of the artists I see a lot now, like Jacques Louis David, he did the painting The Oath of the Horatii, which is like the three young men, I think it's pledging oath to their father, and you would know it if you saw it, but he was really political in his art. Also, like The Death of Marat, I think, is his painting. And he was a revolutionary during the French Revolution. So yeah, art's always been political, but there's also something beautiful in a lot of the old artworks that were still having a political edge or were overtly political, like portraits of politicians and things like that. And then you mentioned Picasso. His big work that's pretty famous for this is Guernica, which is depicting the bombing at Guernica, Spain. But I think there was a shift in showing the ugliness objectively, just trying to make it sort of as disturbing and unsettling as possible. And artists still talk about this. I actually just watched an interview recently with Marina Abramovic, that performance artist, and she was saying, well, our world is so horrible and unjust, so we have to make this art that's really gonna shock you awake and all this stuff. And it's like, well, actually, if you wanted to make the world, I think, a better place, you would make your art as beautiful as possible. That beauty is something that I think is so unifying and begets more good outside of itself. So yeah, I think that it doesn't mean that you have to make art pretty or pleasing. That's not beauty. It can still be difficult and sometimes even disturbing, but in that there's still beauty.
So that's it's interesting that you distinguish between pretty and beauty, because I think a lot of times people use those almost synonymously. But the way you described beauty before was that beauty has a way of reflecting a deeper truth that brings you closer to God. And so that's an important distinction, because then you can look at things from a perspective that maybe it's not as visually pleasing in the sense that it's depicting something that is bad or horrific even, or I can look at a picture of the crucifixion of Christ, and I can be horrified about the pain associated with it, while still respecting that the beauty associated with that art demonstrates the key to salvation and reconciliation with God. So what do you think? Well, let me ask you this. You mentioned World War One, and again, I think you can almost look at it through the context of what was going on at the time, and maybe understand a kind of depression that ekes in that way. But as you're talking about this, it almost reminds me a little bit, from a literature standpoint, of Tolkien. And if you look at Tolkien's world and what he's describing, there's the kind of that comparison that God creates and Satan can't. Satan can't create. He can only pervert that which has been created. And do you feel almost as if there's this struggle going on within the art world right now, where there's the natural beauty that God creates and that God inspires, and then there's the perverse, that is being elevated and almost as a form of mocking.
Yes, I absolutely think that's what's happening. I think the scary thing is that in the art world today, I don't think that we're really making any art. I don't think that you can call it art. And so there's very few examples of artists, I think, today making good art.
So how would you distinguish between what's going on and art?
So, yes, like you're saying, I think that it's a destructive force. I think that it's specifically to tear down the basis of our society. I think that art and architecture is a visual manifestation of our values, of how our country and our whole world is doing, and what we believe. And I think that there has been a concerted effort, as you well know, to rip down the foundations of the West. And I think, like we talked about World War I, and also in the War on Ugly, especially the part two, talking about World War II. And this is not to say anything about the validity of those wars or anything like that. It's to say, okay, objectively, the amount of destruction and also the center stage that art actually really took. You know, World War I there was a lot of destruction, not near as much as World War II, but that was the sort of a crushing of people's spirit. I mean, I can imagine if we lived through that time, like the sheer amount of destruction, seeing the amount of people that you would know, your home, everything being literally obliterated, how that would make you hopeless. And so you start seeing that art specifically becomes meaningless. Like in the Dada movement, it's supposed to mean nothing, and that's a movement coming out of World War I. It's supposed to mean nothing, and then on the other hand, you have other movements that are about this sort of machine takeover of people, and that's when you start to see, you know, like it's man versus machine. And then in World War II, the amount of destruction, like just in France alone, 1.8 million buildings were damaged or destroyed. And art, you might know about the Monuments Men, and there's no exact numbers around how much art was lost, destroyed, or looted, but just the Monuments Men alone recovered 5 million stolen cultural objects, and a lot are still outstanding. And so there was just at a foundational core level, and whether like intentional or not, our world was just entirely different. And the art, the buildings, that is our tangible history and our connection to our story and so many other things.
I know it almost sounds like there's kind of like a Library of Alexandria moment where you lose so much at a given time to destruction that it sets you back, and at the same time that you saw kind of this massive atheistic movement with communism, and then you look at communist architecture, especially with like the brutalist movement and this move toward, you know, efficiency. And I mean, you can look at the you can go to the mall in Washington D.C. and you can just tell when things were built. And if it's got that kind of gorgeous Greco-Roman influence, you know it was all before, or not all, but largely before the 30s. And then you see stuff coming in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and all of a sudden you get these really, really just like boxy, ugly pieces of architecture. I think I find it fascinating that you know, people will kind of denigrate the Dark Ages or the medieval era, and then you look at the Gothic cathedrals that people made and recognize that they did this without this sort of heavy equipment, which means they were actually pouring themselves into the creation of something, the completion of which they would never see in their own lifetime. And you feel like there was something poured into that went way beyond just the physical labor that was required to build it. And I don't feel that when I look at modern architecture.
No, and I think, it does seem like there was an old world and now there's a new one. It genuinely feels like there has been a split and we're on this new sort of timeline. But especially with the world wars, I think because that was such not just a foundational change in aesthetics, but also the new ideologies that were brought in, like you said, the atheism, but then also, no more kings, no more, we're going to have what, the United States and is going to be the new power and all these really big shifts. Well, they said, okay, well, we need a new architecture and a new art for this to reflect these new values.
I kind of feel like because even when you look at like I look at the sort of architecture that, like the Jefferson inspired, and it was very Greco-Roman, but it does feel like there is a positive notion of equality within Scripture. You see it, we're equal in Christ. There's a positive civic notion on equality before the law, but then there's also like a hyper egalitarianism which seeks to erode any sort of differences or to diminish the exceptional, to where if we see something that's truly exceptional, the fear that it could cause others to feel less of themselves as opposed to being inspired by it, is sufficient justification to denigrate, eradicate it, destroy it. And I feel like a lot of us feel like that's been going on, and we've been told that morally we're supposed to celebrate it. And again, you broke out of this. Like you were someone that was on the pathway to feeling that way about it. You had all the appropriate education, all the incredible opportunities, and then you have this interaction with your faith and with God that causes you to see very differently. So I guess that kind of begs my next question is, this has been going on for so long right now. And when you look at most of the institutions, especially within academia, the things you're saying would probably get you kicked out of school. Like I can't imagine you boldly proclaiming this in a way that would land you a job at a gallery or anything. So has this institution gone so far gone that it's almost impossible to recover, and we just have to build something else? Like, what do you think needs to happen for us to recover kind of more of a cultural sense of, or a more of a cultural consensus on what genuine beauty is?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it's the most important question. And I think, again, at least I can look at myself and say, this worked for me, and I believe that it would work for everyone. I think before you can fix anything in the aesthetic realm, there has to be a return to Jesus in the hearts of every single person. Because I think that's the foundation, and that's really actually all you need. Because I think, and it's interesting, I think you brought up Gothic cathedrals, and I'll just say really quickly, I think looking at the society that those cathedrals came out of, they were deeply faithful. Every person was a Christian. And I actually think, I just read this wonderful book called The Stones of Venice by John Ruskin, who I love. I didn't read the whole thing, which is 500,000 words. I read the abridged version. But he talks about how the beauty and the variety and the imagination and the detail of a Gothic building is actually the faith and the dignity of the worker and the artist made manifest, which is the ultimate Christian thing, is to have people who are going to build buildings that are doing it out of the love of God, and they're not being, for example, if you look back at and you talk about Jefferson, going back to like the buildings of ancient Rome. Well, that was not a Christian society, and what was demanded of the worker was perfection, which is another way of, in Ruskin's view, to make the worker a sort of tool. It's like you do this job and you do it perfectly. And there's very little imagination and sort of worship that goes into that. But then you look at these amazing, and it's the artwork that we really look at. I mean, I don't think we so much look at, ancient Greece and Rome as having, although they had beautiful works of art and architecture, I think a lot of us, when we think of beauty, we think of the art of the Christian West. And so that art came from a moral faith foundation in Christ and unity in Him. And so I just think that that is the answer, which is kind of a simple but difficult answer perhaps. But I do have a lot of hope that that is going to happen. I think we've kind of reached a point in our world where people are quite fed up and feel a lot of the similar, even if you're not even fed up, a lot of people like have no hope and things are really difficult and they're returning to Christ.
No, I think it's true. My oldest daughter, her art is the theater. She loves the theater, and my youngest daughter loves to sing. And it was amazing because when my oldest daughter first really wanted to be in theater, I remember thinking, as her father, like, oh boy, here we go. What sort of environment is this going to be and whatnot? And I can remember having this moment where it was almost like God was telling me, like, how dare you, potentially dissuade or discourage her from going into an environment that belongs to me. It doesn't belong to those who would denigrate it. It doesn't belong to those who would call evil good or ugly beautiful. And if, my daughter wants to go and help reclaim that area for Christ. And again, it's not even in the sense that every play has to do that. It's more about everything she does to the glory of God. And it's the same thing with my youngest daughter when she sings, and you can just tell. And so I think there is something just incredible about that. And I think there needs to be a Reconquista. But it's going to take people that are willing to go and stand against the status quo and understand that there could be persecution for that.
Yeah, I think, first of all, it's amazing. I totally agree. I think the arts are so obviously incredibly important. And every person that can go in with a pure heart and working for Jesus is huge. I think it's interesting because I still get invited to the Sotheby's openings. And I'm like, oh my gosh, you guys haven't taken me off the list yet. That's great. I think actually a lot more people might deep down agree, at least on the aesthetics, that what's happening now is not good. Because you look at it and you're like, I was there once, but I do think that there might be more acknowledgement that there needs to be a change, because I think we've been in such an aesthetic rut for so long. But I think what's interesting is that, especially, again, I keep pointing to after the World Wars, but I think that art has been such a visual sign, and saying that it's the avant-garde, I think, is the perfect word for it. Because it's not just that it's edgy in the way that it looks, but I think that art is a real sign of telling us where we're going and what lies in store for us in the future. Because I think there's been so much outrage around music and movies and our general pop culture. People are like, wow, this is so depraved and horrible, which it is. But art was there first, like 50 years ago. And I think that it is truly leading the way and breaking the walls of like where we're going, like I said. And so looking back, just in some of the research that I've done for the War on Ugly series, it was really interesting to see, especially, again, after the war, there was this guy, he was an art critic, historian, named Herbert Reed, And I guess some of these guys, we forget about them, but in their day, they were important. And he was talking about how after the war in the 50s, art has had to accept the triumph of the machine. And that if traditional painting and sculpture was going to exist in the future, man would have to make a compromise with the machine. And I think one of the things that I see so much is that now kind of the future of art is to remove the person, to remove the artist, and to make it all machine. Example, I think about a year ago in 2024, an artist, not a human person, a humanoid robot running on an AI program. Her name's Ada. She sold a work of art at Sotheby's for $1 million. And so I think that there's, especially going forward, going to be an even bigger gulf where I hope, going to make it be where its actual human creativity is going to be extremely valued. And we see it in other areas, but even in architecture and every art form, music. But this art has been signaling this for a long time. And yeah, I just think that's going to be leading us to another sort of crossroads where I hope that it will point people back to at least saying, okay, this is not good. We shouldn't proceed this way.
No, I think it's it is interesting that when we do put things in perspective with respect to our relationship with God, there's a certain joy and peace that comes from that cannot be replicated or just manufactured, by a machine or by an algorithm. We can kind of sense the authenticity even when it becomes more difficult, and I think it goes back to that whole idea that only God can create, and He created us to be creative. And when we subordinate that creativity to His will and to His glory, all of a sudden we get something that is not just beautiful or inspiring, but it's also uplifting, as opposed to perverse or denigrating. And I think what you said about that idea that if good art or beautiful art is that which uplifts and reveals a closer truth that brings us closer to God, then that which does the opposite of those things can be properly described as ugly. And I think, because you've been getting at this, ugly art is not just a result of a lack of talent. Ugly art is a result of an unhealthy or perverse worldview, and it has an objective. It's not just there to oppose what is good. It has an objective, which is nefarious. And I think sometimes we look at it as, okay, well, that's not, I don't like that because I think it's bad or it doesn't appeal to me. And it's like, well, wait a second. You can have something that you do not prefer. You can have two beautiful pieces of art, one that you more prefer versus another one, but there isn't necessarily a moral connotation with respect to the preference in that particular case. But you can have something else where I think we've almost been taught to believe that we're not allowed to criticize something that we look at as going, no, there's something that goes beyond bad into the nefarious, into like the spiritually devoid or evil. And I get to call it for what it is.
No, and I think I completely agree. And I think looking at it, it's actually kind of smart what they've done, because you almost don't have a leg to stand on to say, no, this is wrong, because they say, oh, well, actually you saying it's wrong makes it more of a piece of art. And I think it's interesting because I do believe there's a twofold purpose to art in the art world these days. Because I've been thinking like, well, okay, because some people say, oh, it's money laundering and this stuff, which I have no comment on. But okay, if you want, that's great. Lots of money is put in.
Why can't you money launder pretty things?
But yeah, exactly. That's what I was going to say. It's like, well, then why can't it be something pretty? Why can't it be a beautiful sculpture? Why does it have to be a banana with duct tape?
Well, okay, so I have two final questions for you because I appreciate how generous you've been with your time. The first question is there a particular piece of art, or actually piece of art and building or structure that you hold up as just being like, we'll say one of, I won't ask for your favorite because that's too difficult, but what's a building or a sculpture or a piece of art that you would put in kind of like your top 3 that you would recommend everyone check out, see, or view?
Okay. I immediately thought of something which is so unlike me, but it's actually a piece of music. I recently saw with my family Mahler's Resurrection, which is actually a modern piece of music at the LA Philharmonic, conducted by Gustavo Dudamel. And I think that piece, I've never felt like walking away from something where you're like, wow, that was a masterpiece. And it's on Spotify. I think they also have it conducted by Leonard Bernstein. And so I think that is the most incredible. If you can possibly in your lifetime go see that symphony in person, it's amazing. And then I think also that painting, The Judgment of Solomon by Matthias Stamm, which is at the Museum of Fine Arts in Houston. It's an incredible painting. So I think those are two real works of beauty.
And then my final question, where can people, what are you working on now? I know you have the War on Ugly series coming out, the War on Beauty series. Where can people find you on social media, and where can they learn more about the work that you're doing?
So I am on all social media platforms at The War on Beauty. And yeah, just working on continuing this crusade against ugly and really trying to go more offensive with it, because that's what we need to do. So yeah.
Julie James Davis, thank you very much for being here. Go check out The War on Beauty. And as always, you know, I've said this before. I obviously speak in a lot of political realms, and I've had a lot of people come up to me and they're like, how do I get involved in politics? And half the time I'll stop them and be like, what do you like to do? Like, what sort of talents has God given you? And every once in a while I'll have someone say, well, I love music, or I love to paint, or I love to write. And I'll be like, you know, maybe the greatest thing that you could do to both glorify God and save your country is to actually lean more into the various gifts that God has given you. Because if there is one culturally shaping institution that we have to take back, and that I believe that as Christians we have an obligation to take back for the glory of God, it is the arts. So thank you very much for everything that you're doing. Thank you for watching. Go make sure that you follow her and go check out those videos on YouTube. They're absolutely outstanding. Once again, thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next episode.